Okay, so like I was saying 10 minutes ago, before we went over, moving on into where we picked up last week. So I want to transition to this week. We're picking up at um the design thinking framework. So let me share the slide with you guys. Uh-oh, that never works when I do it that way. Let's see if I can escape. Okay, so can you see my screen? Yes?
Yes, yes,
Okay. Okay, cool. Okay, so where we left off last week, we left off on the design thinking framework. So the design thinking framework is the framework or the methodology that we're following in this course. So a framework is just basically, like the rules, the guidelines in which we design, develop, and move forward. So it's the set of rules, it's the I guess you can say I don't want to say the strategy, but it's the ideology that we're following, right? It's the process that we're following. That's a good way of saying it. So the design thinking framework is the process of design and development that we're following throughout this course. So there are phases to it. And if we go back one, when you follow the design thinking framework, the phases are first we empathize, which is what we talked a lot about yesterday. Well, I'm not yesterday, but the last class when we talked about accessibility, we talked about, like I said, socioeconomic considerations. We talked about making sure that we're considerate of first-time users to the internet. We talked about making sure that we really dive into who the user is and what their problem is, and just coming from a place of empathy. So we have been diving a lot into that. The second phase of the design thinking framework approach to UX design is to define. And then the third phase is to ideate. The fourth phase is to prototype. The fifth phase is to test. So in this week, we're going to break down each one of these 5 phases and go into more detail. So moving into and diving into the first phase, which is to empathize, um, the primary, the primary goal when we're in the empathize phase or the empathy phase is to learn more about the user, their problems, their wants, their needs, how they will experience your design. So with the reading assignment, when or the article challenged you to blindfold yourself and go through an application, that's an example of kind of just putting yourself in a position where you can think about how the person, the end user, will experience your design. Another part of the empathy phase is to make sure that we let go of our assumptions, right? Because if you think about it last week, we went into it with a lot of assumptions of, well, I don't think they would click here. Or another assumption that the stakeholder made was that people would only be interested in coming to book an assessment, right? Or to book a service. There were a lot of assumptions made. And one part in empathy is to let go of all of your assumptions and let your research and findings guide your decision and design making process. Meaning, you may go into it with the assumption of what you think people are going to do, what you think people need, but you really need to qualify, really just let go of your assumptions and let your interviews and the research and the backstories that you dive into kind of dictate what the user needs or what they want. The second phase, is to define. So when we move into the defining phase of the design thinking framework, based on, so to define is based on research gathered it's actually be from, based on research gathered from the empathize phase, which problems are the most important and why. So the most important outcome of this phase is a clear problem statement. A value proposition would also be a great takeaway from this phase. Why the user should use your solution and how it will benefit them. So the ultimate goal, so we kind of go through and we empathize, right? And we do a lot of research. But once we do all of that research, we go back and we look at it, and we look during this phase, we're looking at the research we came up with from our interviews and from our empathy maps, which we'll talk about later. And we have to come up with a clear definition of what the problem is. We want to clearly define what the problem is. What's the problem statement? And that's a necessity. So if nothing else happens during the define phase, as designers and as a design team, you have to come out of this phase with a clear problem statement. And as we move forward, we'll talk about the structure of a clear problem statement and what's universally accepted amongst UX. But that's important. Now, a value add or a bonus will be to come out with a proposition statement as well. And that proposition statement is just a clear statement of why the user should, use your solution and how it will benefit them. So an example of that, well, I kind of don't want to jump ahead, so I'm just going to keep going. The third phase of the design thinking framework is to ideate. So when we ideate, we generate as many design solutions as possible. So this involves collaborative brainstorming with your team. This can include marketing, development, and the stakeholders. So if you think about what we went over last week, when we all were kind of like looking at each other's design and we were talking through some of the possible things that a user may want to see, some possible solutions and ways that we can make the app useful, just kind of jumping inside of the head of who we project the end user to be. And I think we did a good job last week of collectively coming up with different ideas, and just different solutions and different features that we can implement in the design. The uh the the final phase of the design thinking framework is to prototype and test. So to create an early model prototype that can be used for testing. So that's when we use tools such as Figma, Adobe XD to kind of create a click-through working model so that we can actually observe users go through the design and we can test our findings, test our solutions, test whether or not we actually are solving the problem for the user, and identify if there are any pain points that we may have overlooked. Let me go back. I feel like I missed we did 1, 2, 3, 4. Why do I feel like, oh, because prototype was this, yeah. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, empathize is when we actually go through and we make sure that we understand who's using it, what the problem is, and we just, we're dedicated to making sure that we put ourselves in their shoes and what's the best possible solution. Define is when we come out with one clear problem statement, where we're kind of narrowing down all of the findings and all of the problems that we discovered during the empathize phase, and we're narrowing everything down to one primary problem that we're designing and solving for. The ideate phase is when we come up with as many solutions as we can to resolve the problem. And then the prototype phase is the phase of us actually going through and designing. So we're taking all of our findings, all of our ideas, we've narrowed down the ideas, and we're actually going to start to build the prototype. So build what that flow of the application will look like. And then the fifth final phase is the testing phase. And that's when we roll out our prototype to the end user. Are there any questions so far?
I have a question.
Mhm.
So with the, well, I know we're going to see it, but when we get to the prototype part or the Adobe XD, are we going to learn how to use that too?
No, this class only focuses on Figma because Figma is the industry standard right now. But you can on your own. Like I would recommend that you explore or at least just kind of click around another what am I trying to say? Another prototyping software. Because
Okay.
even though it's the most popular right now, a company may still be on XD and they just didn't make the investment to switch over to Figma. So just to kind of get a feel, to kind of see how they're similar, I always think it's a good idea to utilize different frameworks, technology, software, just because you never know what company you're going to interview for,
Mhm.
and different companies use different types of software. But it's not, I will say that the differences between the software is not so stark that you're going to feel lost, right? It's usually a quick ramp up. Once you know one really well, you can usually quickly adjust because most follow the same standards.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Outside of, well, inside of, in addition to, in addition to the design thinking framework, business requirements are a big part of your job as a UX designer. Understanding and adhering to business requirements. So what are business requirements? Business requirements are the requirements from whatever entity assigns the project. And the business requirements include the goals and parameters that are set for you. So the business, when I'm at work, we just call, the stakeholders generically the business. The business is whatever within a corporation, the business is going to be whatever stakeholder, a stakeholder being the lead manager, um, who is requesting a feature or requesting a new web application or requesting a new experience. So whatever administrative person or whatever manager or whatever management team is requesting whatever it is you're designing, they're going to express what their goals are and they're going to express what their parameters are. And in a corporate environment, typically that's going to come from your BA. So your business analyst, like I was telling you guys before, they usually have a back and forth conversation. This is how it works in agile companies. They usually have a back and forth conversation with the stakeholders. And the stakeholders have sometimes it can be one day, sometimes it can be weeks of conversations discussing what the goals are for the application or the feature and what the budget is and what the timeline is. So the budget, when we talk about parameters, we're talking about what's the budget for the project. And we're also talking about what's the deadline for the project and what's the expectations. So when you're designing, not only are you always thinking about the user, but you're also thinking about how you can accommodate the user within the goals and the parameters of the business requirements. So those two things have to be in your mind the entire time. So the business goals typically describe the users they want the design to target, right? So who are the users, the outcomes, the business requirements will definitely um, detail or they should detail the outcomes that they want the design to achieve. The business goals also will go is their vision for the design's final look and functionality. So sometimes going into it, the design, the stakeholders will already express to you what what their vision is for the final product. And like I said, the business requirements also guides the design and testing process in terms of being mindful of the overall budget and time parameters and deadlines. Sometimes I want to kind of focus in on the vision for the design's final look and functionality. Also, as UX designers, um, sometimes what the business owner or the stakeholder, sometimes what they want is not what we believe to be the best aesthetically. So sometimes a business stakeholder will suggest something and it's not aesthetically appealing, or it is not present, it's not presenting, it's not following design standards, right? And as a UX designer, the most you can do is offer an alternative and make sure that the alternative you offer is based in facts, based in performance, based in research, based in Lighthouse, like we went over last week when we kind of looked at the Lighthouse report, opposed to it just being, well, I think this is ugly, or this is a horrible design, or you shouldn't go this way. I don't like the colors. Anytime that you're trying to um, vouch for a design direction, you want to use terms when it comes to colors, like these colors don't pass accessibility, or these colors may be hard for someone who's colorblind, or the spacing that you want will make it hard for someone who's using touchscreen. Um, you want to lean more towards that as much as you can. Sometimes you don't win. Now, when it comes to accessibility, you should always win. If someone is proposing something in design that's not going to pass accessibility in terms of screen readers or assistive technology, the UX designer, the UX team should always win in those situations. However, it is important that you emotionally detach yourself from creative artistic suggestions, because I can tell you from experience, sometimes or a lot of times, what the business push for, what the stakeholders push for, sometimes is what we as UX designers absolutely hate. And then sometimes we have to just accept it and design what they ask for. So just be mindful of that. Again, when we talk about parameters that business requirements may set for you, they typically describe the project's budget, timeline, and scope, meaning like how big of a project it is, the specific tools and systems that designers must use or design for. So to your point, a business requirement, excuse me, let's just say, for example, if um, let's say, for example, a company only uses Adobe XD, but you've been trained to work in Figma. Well, that's going to be a parameter that you have to design within, right? So if they tell you that this company uses Adobe XD, you can't force their hand and then show up with mocks that are in Figma. You're going to have to use Adobe XD because that's what the company uses. Also, you have to remember it's a group effort, it's a collaborative. So you're sharing files too. So you can't be in a silo where no one else can access your files or no one else on the team can edit, or, because a lot of times you guys are sharing documents. You don't personally own a document. The document is on a shared drive, and other designers are adding features, adding design ideas, taken away from. So everyone has to be on the same page. The requirements and standards the design must meet. So the standards come with like things like branding, right? So if you're working for an entity and their brand voice is established, that's a parameter that you have to work within. You can't just choose colors that don't match the brand, right? You can't just use font that doesn't match the brand. There's also sometimes you'll have standards in terms of how swiftly views may need to load. Another example of standards and requirements may be making sure that every feature is accessible. Another standard and requirement may be to make sure that you include inclusive photography and representation. without or throughout the design. So those are all examples. Do you have any questions about what we've gone over so far?
No.
No.
All right, so let's going all the way back to phase one. Let's deep dive into each phase and what each phase entails. Phase one, empathize with the users. How do we do that? There are some powerful methods for empathizing with users as a UX designer. One of the most popular, and one of the most effective is to interview the end user. The end user is not so far, you guys have conducted interviews with the stakeholders. So in phase one, you guys actually gathered business requirements. So that first set of questioning that we've done up to this point in the course and the conversations that you guys had with the business owners, that process actually was the process of you guys gathering business requirements. So those business requirements gave you the framework or the parameters and the goals of the business owner, right? When we move into phase one, you're going to keep that in the back of your, or not in the forefront of your mind as you design. But this phase of it, this phase of the course, we're moving into implementing um, implementing the framework that we're designing within. So phase one, now you guys are going to move into interviews. So there's different ways you can conduct interviews for the end user. So for your project, for with the landscaping company, at this point you will be interviewing homeowners who would um, typically want to secure landscaping services. Now you're interviewing them. For the other project that we've been talking about with the fitness services, now you're going to actually start the process of interviewing the clients, right? And if you can't access the clients, interviewing people who would typically be clients for the personal training services. So interviews take many forms, but UX designers commonly use these for, and they're questionnaires and surveys. So questionnaires and surveys would be, you actually print or either you have an online questionnaire and you ask end users or likely end users to fill out a questionnaire in a survey. Surveys could, so if a site or an application or a feature already exists, or if a product already exists, surveys may be, what's your experience? Let's say, for example, if we were hired for Lifetime and Lifetime already has a website and you were interviewing their gym members, some of the questions may say, have you ever tried to sign up for a membership package on Lifetime's website? Was it easy? How would you rate it from a scale to 1 to 10 in terms of how intuitive it was? Were you able to complete the task? Did you experience any frustration while you were completing the task? If so, what was the frustration? You know what I mean? So how would you rate the overall experience of finding services, business hours, adding on to services, etc., utilizing Lifetime's website? So that would be an example of like questionnaires and surveys. In-person interviews a lot of times are the same questions, except for they're just not in written format, right? So the questions are typically the same, but it's a face-to-face interview. Phone interviews obviously happen over the phone, and then video interviews happen utilizing software such as Zoom or Google Meet or whatever the video platform is. So this week, you guys are going to form questions based on if your business owner or your stakeholder already has an existing framework or platform or product, you're going to build questions around that experience. If your business owner, stakeholder does not already have an existing application, then you want to form questionnaires that can gauge what the user would like to see implemented, right? What would make it an easy experience for them. And a good idea or a good practice is to ask end users if they already use or if they have experience with using the application and which one is their favorite. So, for example, going back to the gym model or the personal training and fitness model, you may ask, have you ever signed up for personal training services online or through an application? And they may say yes. And you would say, well, can you list two to three or more, or um, two or more applications, websites that you use to sign up for personal training services or fitness services? Which one was your favorite? What did you like about the process? You see what I'm saying? Or what did you dislike? What do you wish was present? Or what would be a great user experience for you? Those sorts of questions. And you would ask those questions, like I said, either you can give the questionnaire to the business owner, and the business owner, actually, no, I don't suggest that at all. I was going to say you can give the questionnaire to the business owner, and the business owner can give the questionnaire to their clients. But if it's easy, if that's not feasible, then you, like I said, may just rally up people from the general public on your own who may be typical personas or real life personas, so to speak, of people who would um, utilize whatever service your stakeholder is offering. So take some time. Are you going to do question? I honestly would suggest that because you're in training, you do all four methods. So interview four different people. One person, you're going to interview them using questionnaires and surveys. The second person, you'll interview in person. The third person, phone. The fourth person, video, because that's also going to strengthen your portfolio and allow you to say that you have experience in all four methods or the most commonly used four methods of interviewing. Are there any questions about um, interviews?
No.
Continuing on with interviews, one thing that you want to consider, right, when we talked about those parameters. So here's a situation where business parameters, goals, and requirements are setting guidelines that you follow, or they're setting boundaries in terms of how you proceed. So let's say, for example, if you have a 2-week deadline, like they want this new feature up and running in 2 weeks, that's a time restraint. So as you're interviewing, that kind of tells you I can't spend a week interviewing people. I have to get the interviews done within 1 day or 2 days max, because the overall project has to be completed within 2 weeks, right? Or the budget. Um, there's different ways, that you can interview people as well. So if let's just say, for example, a company, everything is money for a company in a corporate environment. So really, the amount of time you spend is translated into dollars. So if you're in a scenario where the budget for a corporation, they're not going to tell you what the budget is. I've never had anyone tell me in a corporate environment what the budget was for a project that I'm working on. The business layer knows that, but it's still a consideration though. So I may not know that they've invested $10 million in the rollout of this project when I'm working in a bigger corporate environment, but I do know what the timeline is for the project. I do know what the deadlines are. So in terms of budget, I know that it's always the goal to get things done efficiently and proficiently, meaning that as quickly as possible and as effectively as possible. Um, Balancing research information and parameters. So another thing, once you actually gather the insight from your end users, Now you have on the left hand or the right hand, you have what the user wants, you have their pain points, you have what makes them have a pleasant experience, what they feel creates a pleasant experience for them in utilizing the app. But then you also have the parameters. So what I mean by that is, let's just say when you look at everything, ultimately implementing all the features that the end user wants, let's just say ultimately that would take um a year. It would take a year to implement, right? But you only have 2 weeks to implement it. So balancing research information and parameters looks like, ultimately, I wish I could give the end user everything that they want. They came up with some really good, innovative ideas, but to implement all of them would take a year, but we only have 2 weeks. So how can we, you know, um, best meet in the middle, right? What can we implement that the user wants that will be an MVP, a most valuable product, or a most valuable ad, an MVA, a most valuable ad? What could we implement that would be a most valuable ad and still meet that 2 week deadline? So that's an example of balancing research information and parameters. Another thing, working with smaller companies, or you're working with smaller, like just say like sole proprietorships or smaller partnerships, or just corporations that are transparent about their budget. Another thing may be with your research and information for the development team to implement what the end user wants. Let's just say, for example, that budget is going to take $10,000 in development hours, but the small business owner only has a budget of $1,000 to implement the solution. So that's balancing research, information, and parameters. This is what the end user wants based on our research, but this is the budget. So how can we best give the end user the experience they want within the confines of the budget that has been presented to us? Any questions about that?
No.
Okay. I'm looking at the time and we have 3 minutes, and I don't want to start empathy maps and then go into break. So let me just go back a little bit in terms of, um, no, actually, we'll just take our break. So it's time for our 1 hour break. So I will see you guys back in 15 minutes. Well, yeah, roughly 15 minutes. We'll meet back at 9:15.
Okay.
Okay.